let's talk about New Atheism. What is it and where did it come from?
The term originates probably about 2004, I think it is, and it was used and it has been used to describe public atheists who are quite noisy about their atheism. Some would say aggressive, others would say just assertive.
Yeah.
It's tied in with a number of the geopolitical issues of the time. I think that's an important factor that's sometimes lost in the mix, but the focus was on the rationality, or as they would say it, the irrationality of religious belief.
Okay, and what were some of those factors that really led it to rise up in the way that it did? Because it sort of took over the culture for a long time.
Yeah, it did. It's important to say that the advocates of New Atheism would simply say they were just being atheists. They were just stating the case against God, or the case against religion, or the case against the supernatural. They were deploying reason, so on and so forth. They would not see anything new about it, nor would they see anything particularly kind of historically distinctive. Most other people, those who weren't actually sort of advocates of New Atheism themselves, noticed not new arguments, but certainly a new tonal difference.
Yeah.
And that, I think, came from the fact that, well, put it this way. In 1968, a sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, wrote an editorial in the New York Times in which he said, by the 21st century, religions will be isolated sects huddled together to avoid a worldwide secular culture. It didn't turn out like that. And in the first decade of the 21st century, you obviously have 9/11. You have George W. Bush, president, openly, publicly evangelical Christian, as president of the United States. These big geopolitical factors are tangled up with religion, and New Atheism was a reaction against that, a reaction against the prevalence, the prominence, and sometimes the violence of religion in contemporary public life.
Okay. I think the defining feature for most people is its reliance on science and scientific arguments, treating God as a scientifically testable hypothesis and saying the evidence doesn't stack up. Is that something that's new, or is that something that's a bit older?
There's a long history of doing that. The history of science and religion is not one of antagonism, certainly not one of dominant antagonism that it's popularly believed to be. But that doesn't mean there haven't been scientific antagonists in the past who have argued with various different logics and evidence bases that science, whatever that exactly means, disproves religion or God, whatever they mean. So the idea that you can disprove science and religion through God is actually a very old one. The current formulation of it, or the one that was probably most prevalent in the New Atheists, was through evolutionary science. Yeah. And that is a more modern thing. Historically, you might get things like the mechanization of the human body, or the mechanization of the universe, or behaviorism or Freudianism, as scientific arguments against religion, less so evolution, although there were some. What's unusual, I think, in more modern times is the way that evolution or Darwinism became weaponized for an atheistic cause.
You mentioned part of your thesis is also that this dichotomy, this apparent dichotomy in the argument that science is against religion seems to pop up first with John William Draper's book, I think towards the end of the 19th century, and then it was banned by the Vatican. Are those the kind of arguments that John William Draper relied on rather than utilising evolution? Yes.
Draper was a chemist, and it's probably fair to say not a brilliant historian. He was also wedded to conflict metaphors in a lot of his writing. He, interestingly, was present in the famous Oxford debate in 1860 between Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley, which was supposed to be this iconic evolutionary theistic moment. Interestingly, though, he doesn't mention that, and he doesn't really major that much on evolution. It's an issue. A bigger issue for him is the lawfulness of creation. And actually, in many ways, this is the most historic argument. In one way, it goes all the way back to Aristotle and certainly the use of Aristotle in the Abbasid Caliphate and then in medieval Europe. If the universe is perfectly lawful, what space is there for God? And that probably underlines what Draper says more than anything else. His is a very long historical analysis, so it takes lots of different angles, but the lawfulness of creation, which interestingly is used by some believers to legitimize belief in God, is used by him against belief in God.
So he takes the laws of nature as eternal and as the starting point, and says and takes them out of the mix from a creative power.
Yes, well, it's partly that, but it's more that if the laws of nature are pre-existent and absolute, what space is there for God?
It's funny because that is exactly a kind of discussion that was happening with a particular sect, a very militant and very missionary sect in India towards the turn of the 19th century called the Arya Samaj, who argued that there were pre-existing laws of nature and that the creator was simply an assembler of matter rather than the originator of it. And this led to a strain of atheism within Indian subculture that what need is there for God then? And it's something that the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he wrote on that, especially in the early part of his books, he wrote on that especially about that question.
Because there's a separation between the laws and the lawgiver, as a sort of, saying that one can exist without the other. But that is interesting about what you talk about John William Draper, because he did that, and he also, you say in your book, he kind of, or him and White, I think, in a sense invented this narrative that there is a conflict between science and religion, and that really gained a lot of currency, despite perhaps its actual historical accuracy. I mean, is that fair?
That is fair. I guess the best way of putting it is that they had a selective reading of history through a particular lens.
Yeah.
In one sense, all historians do that, but it was more intentional in their instance. Yeah. The last third of the 19th century is the period in which science and religion do come closest to being an actual kind of war, an actual war. And historically, there have been lots of examples of clerics, for example, in Europe, speaking out against certain scientific developments. Most famously, of course, you have the Galileo trial of the 1630s. What Draper and White do is normalise those moments of conflict and tell a story that treats them as the basis. There's scholarship being done recently which strongly suggests actually they have a slightly more subtle approach than that, and they're not antagonistic to religion altogether, but just certain types of religion. But be that as it may, they are responsible for these very substantial articulations of a continuous narrative which is controlled by the idea of warfare.
On the other hand, do you think it would be fair to say no, it wasn't warfare, it's harmony for centuries?
No.
Where would you stand?
Well, we had this discussion when making the programme, and I've been thinking about it for quite a while, and I was actually giving a paper on it at a conference in Birmingham just a couple of weeks or so ago. Scholarship has moved in this area in the last 40 years or so away from conflict, and the most favoured thesis, not a metaphor itself, but thesis at the moment is John Hedley Brooks' complexity thesis, which simply says, as you would expect, the relationship between the two is complex. It certainly hasn't been the case of pure harmony.
Is that a thesis? Surely that's
probably call anything that.
That's a description of a...
Well, I mean, in retrospect, it looks like a statement of the obvious, but you have to remember that at the time, the controlling metaphor was warfare. And apart from anything else, what John and Peter Harrison have also done is pointed out that the terms science and religion are relatively modern terms. Yeah. They cover a multitude of different factors to essentialise each of them, and then to essentialise the relationship between them.
To define them against each other.
Yeah, define. There is such a thing as science, and there is such a thing as religion, and then these two entities are in such a thing as conflict with one another. You're simplifying at every single stage along the journey. The problem is that its complex is not as compelling a message as its war. It's a complete mistake to go to the other extreme, to replace one simplistic metaphor with another, harmony, but it leaves you with this really challenging approach. Well, how do we describe it then? How do we encapsulate it? And I talk a little bit about this in the BBC series. We might come on to it. But there have been periods of greater harmony, periods of greater tension, and it depends on the particular period of time and the scientific discipline, and also the character of the religion at the time, to depend on which is which.